Andrea, thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to read your bio. So we have Andrea Klunder is a podcast producer, host, mentor, and launch consultant. Her shows include The Creative Imposter, Podcast Envy, and in 2017, she launched Power Your Story, a podcast produced by students with diverse learning challenges at a Chicago public high school. Her mission is to use podcasting as a tool for connection, storytelling, and personal empowerment. Andrea's background also includes teaching yoga and meditation, opening and operating her own studio, and singing and acting. Got a lot of stuff going on.
I know.
Just a Renaissance woman. So Andrea and I met at Creative Women's Co-mentoring event last summer, and she introduced herself and talked about her podcasting. I'm like, ooh, I need to talk to that girl. So I reached out to you and we met from there. But then I took a trip to Costa Rica, and it was the first time I'd ever traveled by myself. And I seriously, Andrea, just listened to your podcast episodes the entire time. I listened to hours because I took a 4-hour there and back. So 8-hour drive by myself. So that was at least 8 hours of listening to you. And I listened
binge-worthy.
Yes. And I listened to it on double speed. So that's probably 16 hours of
That's crazy.
Do you not listen on double speed?
I do not. Double speed, even time and a half makes me feel crazy. I have to listen to people speak at normal speed or I feel insane.
No, I totally, so people with accents, I can't listen to on double speed. I don't understand anything when there's an accent of any kind. But, other than that, it's this weird, I'm hyper efficient person. So I'm if I could listen to this 2 times fast, then I'm going to do it. Anyway, so I listened to probably, 16 hours worth of content.
Amazing.
And so Andrea you had me on for your podcast. And when we were, chatting on there, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know so much about you and you don't know anything about, anyway, we talked about that last time. But yeah, I just think that's so great about podcasting of how vulnerable that is, right? Of putting yourself out there. I just think there's a beauty in that. Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that and just that vulnerability piece of podcasting.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that podcasting is a medium and a format that lends itself to the potential for vulnerability, and certainly not every podcaster or every show is designed that way. But there's something about the intimacy of voice, especially when you take away the visual, right? And you take away the camera and the video and you just use voice. There's something very freeing, I think, both in the time that you're recording it, even when you're doing an interview with somebody and you don't have the video and you are just talking, there's something that allows a higher level of disclosure where you feel more comfortable disclosing more. And then as the listener, there's this intimate connection. As you said, you felt like you knew so much about me from listening to the podcast that even if we met, when we did meet in a personal, one-to-one, face-to-face, you can't even get that much information. There's just something about hearing somebody's voice that really connects you into who they're being if they allow for that level of intimacy and disclosure, I think.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of Marco Polo? The app? Marco Polo, not the pool game.
Yes, I have, and I don't fully get it.
Yeah, so one of my girlfriends sent it to me. I'll just show it on the thing. So this is what the app looks like. And then here are the different videos that I've been sending back and forth. So it's just video messages instead of text messages.
Right.
And the reason why I bring that up is just that it's not a back and forth. It's just someone's just sending you a video message and you then respond after they're done. And I feel like that's kind of the same with podcasting, just in the sense that like no one's interrupting you. You say your piece, not based on anyone, like who they are, right? Because in real life, if you were talking to like an 8-year-old woman versus a 14-year-old, it may be a bit different, but you're like how you're speaking in podcasting is just like how you want to present to whoever. And sure, you may have like certain demographics to an audience or whatever, but it's still just like, I love that aspect of you just kind of being you and presenting yourself how you want to.
And it definitely takes, I don't know if it takes practice. I think it's different for everyone. So some people, you know, turn on the microphone and they immediately feel like, oh, there's a microphone in front of me. And then they get self-conscious, you know, in the same way that a camera or a video camera can make people feel self-conscious. I mean, personally, video cameras and cameras make me feel more self-conscious than a microphone.
No, you said that. I hope
but so it depends on the person, like how that relationship with the microphone, and it takes practice feeling comfortable, recording yourself, and then trusting the content, and then also trusting your audience that whatever it is that you have to say is going to resonate and land with your audience. And I think that over time, I've gotten more comfortable being more vulnerable and sharing more of my personal experience. I mean, when I first thought of having a podcast, I wasn't creating a podcast so that I could just talk about myself. I was creating a podcast because I wanted to interview people and I wanted to hear what other people had to say. And I wanted to ask questions. I didn't necessarily want to disclose high volumes of personal information. And I'm making it sound like this is some kind of like diary confessional. It's not that, but over time, the feedback that I received from my audience was that they enjoy the interviews and they like learning about these different creatives that I've sort of curated and want to present to them. And they enjoy hearing that conversation. They learn a lot, but they love, love, love the personal episodes where it's just me talking. And the more personal it is, or the more vulnerably I disclose something, the more it sort of like brings them in, the more riveting it is for them. So there's definitely a craft to saying things that are true and authentic and vulnerable and personal that are still also applicable and useful for your audience. It's not just me talking about whatever I feel like. I think and marinate on what it is exactly that I want to share and how I think it's going to be useful for someone listening.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love that. And I have you ever been to the Moth Stories?
I have not been in person, but I have listened to their podcast quite a bit.
Went for the first time actually in Melbourne. I had never been before, and they have it in Chicago. I always wanted to go, and I just never made it out. And so the first time I went was in Melbourne, which is only like there's only 3 international cities outside of the US.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. But do it anyway. So I was talking with the woman who runs it there. Her name's Mary Lee, and she's awesome. And she's talking about, and I think someone else said this, so she's quoting someone else, but I heard it from her, so I'll quote her. But she talks about speaking from scars, not from wounds. And I love that. I'm sorry, I'm like obviously sick and just
poor thing.
Ask you questions instead of talking. But I love that because, and I think that's just like a part of the vulnerability piece and like knowing your audience, what's going to resonate with them and how much to share about yourself or how much it should be about the interviewee. I feel like the speaking from scars and not from wounds, it's almost like when you're speaking from scars, you're like able to share as far as like helping someone else and lift them up, or even just being able to like be past it, right? And you're kind of telling the story. When you're speaking from wounds, it's almost like you're asking other people to like heal you, you know, when of course, like in any online platform, let's be real, that's not going to happen, right? And it's probably not going to happen the way that you want it to. So if you don't mind, I would love, like, what I loved listening to you from your podcast. Let's just jump right into this, because I feel like this is a scar for you and not a wound anymore. And you can tell me if it is more of a wound, but we'll talk. So you owned a yoga studio and later closed it. And I'd love to hear, like, I've heard about that experience, but I'd love for you to, like, tell people, like, how it went logistically, and then also how you felt about it as you owned it and then closed it and all of that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say definitely a scar that was a wound for a very long time, and then still sometimes is sensitive, right? So even if something is old, and even if something has healed, there's still the mark of it, right? It still can affect you in some way. So my first business venture I started it in 2008 and operated for 5 years, and it was a yoga studio and spa in Chicago. And I started out really small. I was renting a small room inside a chiropractic clinic, and I was there for 2 years, and it went really, really well. And a full class for us was like 7 students. We couldn't fit more than that in there. And if you can imagine the cost of a yoga class being average, like, $15, $18 at that time, and you can only fit 7 people in a class, then you can imagine that your profit margins are fairly small. And so in addition to that, at least in our market, people only really want to take yoga in the evening or on weekends. You don't have a lot of daytime yogis. There is a market for that, but less. And so I knew that even though I was operating at full capacity for our space, it wasn't enough really to pay me in that first 2 years. So the first 2 years, we didn't lose a ton of money, but I was living off of savings and money that I had borrowed from family and a little bit of credit card. And I kept thinking, oh, well, as soon as I expand, as soon as I offer more, then I'll be able to start making a profit, because if we're full now, if I expand, then we're definitely going to get more people. So in the 3rd year, I expanded to a larger storefront, like much larger storefront. Was like, okay, we're ready for more people. And it didn't necessarily happen.
Wasn't it just like 2 blocks away from your original location too? So you're like, close, so it's the same people, right?
It was like 2 blocks away, right around the corner, gorgeous vintage storefront. I put so much just like heart and soul into that space and into cultivating something. And a surprising number of clients didn't come with us, or 2 blocks. To this day, I have no idea why that is. And we did get new people, but we didn't get enough people to make up for that huge leap in not just space, but expenditures. And there was a lot of things that I didn't plan for, being a rookie business owner. I don't have a background in business. I took like a 5-week business course with the Women's Business Development Center before I started my own business. And that course was great. And I learned so much, but like, there's still so many things that you can't possibly know when you start out. And I just kept trying and starting new things, and try this thing and save money here, or offer this new service. And I just kept barely staying at kind of like a break even or slightly less. And so for my personal living expenses, because I either heard and didn't listen to, or I had not heard the whole pay yourself first thing.
I don't think business. That's a common thing,
It's something that I heard a lot after I closed that business.
Yeah, because you were more interested in the business world, right?
Right. And so I just kept doing credit cards, like groceries, credit cards, food, credit cards, transportation, CTA, credit cards, and just was like digging myself into a hole, waiting for this to turn around. And I mean, I was working pretty much wake up, start working, pass out, then wake up, start working, pass out. That's pretty much what my days were like. And eventually after 5 years, when that lease ran out, because I had signed a 3-year lease on that space, I decided to close that space and move on to something else.
Oh, so you've
And
been there for 3 years. That was a long time.
it was a commercial spaces in Chicago tend to be a 3 to 5 year lease is what they try to lock you into. And so even though I sort of could see the writing on the wall sooner than that, it was like, if you want out of your lease early, you have two choices. You can find a new tenant
Mm-hmm.
who to take over the terms of your lease, or you can move out and still be responsible for the balance of your of your lease.
Yeah.
Um, so there really aren't a lot of options once you're locked into that. And so I just kept trying to make it work. And eventually I was exhausted. I was very broke and had a lot of credit card debt. And I just didn't want to do it anymore. It just wasn't, I felt like I could see what it would take to make it successful. And I just didn't have it in me at that point because I was trying to do everything myself.
Yeah.
And I closed it and had a period of pretty severe, not, I don't even know severe, but like my first experience with actual depression.
Mm-hmm.
After that, I had never really experienced depression up to that point. And then suddenly I was like, oh, I have put all of this energy into creating a persona as I am Andrea Klunder. I'm a yoga and meditation teacher, and I'm a yoga studio owner, and I'm an entrepreneur. And I had identified with all of these specific labels. And suddenly I was not those things because I wasn't doing those things. I didn't have a yoga studio. I didn't have a business. I had maybe like 3 or 4 clients that I was still working with, but I didn't even feel like teaching yoga at that time. It just, everything just felt like, ugh, I just wanted to stay in bed and do nothing and not interact with anyone. And obviously, you can't really do that because you have to pay for your life. And I just didn't know what I wanted to do. Friends, well-meaning friends were like, oh, well, the business thing didn't really work out. So why don't you just get a job? Certainly you can get another job. No problem. Like, it's okay. Being an entrepreneur is hard. It's not for everyone. And I was like, no, I did not want to get a job.
Because you came from, like, you were working at the opera house, right? And so
Yeah.
you had a 9 to 5 before, and so you knew what that
Yeah.
entails, what the sacrifices
Yeah.
were.
And so I was just like, I had a full-time job for 8 years. It wasn't what I wanted to do. Every time I thought about working for someone else, it just didn't feel right. But I also didn't know if I was going to continue to be an entrepreneur and start a new business. First of all, what would that be? Second of all, where was I going to get the money? Because at that point I had probably, I think about $30,000 in credit card debt that I had racked up.
And honestly, I'm impressed that it's not more. I'm curious. Like, that's pretty for 3 years, you know what I mean? That you were charging things through a credit card. That's not a lot.
Yeah, so somewhere around 35,000 in credit card debt. And a lot of it is because I also owed my family. So I had taken loans from my parents and then 2 uncles who I'm very fortunate. I'm actually very fortunate to have the family that I have, and B, have not taken money from a lender or a bank because my family, I like technically still owe them this money. And I have a vision of one day paying them back, but I know that they're not sitting there like tabulating interest on
Right.
all this time.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of gratitude for that. But I had a lot of debt to them, and plus this credit card debt. So I had no resources to speak of. I couldn't go ask for more money to start yet another dubious business. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I, at that time, was listening to a lot of podcasts. And so one day it just kind of like dropped into my mind, like people who were creating podcasts were not just creating podcasts, they were also building communities, and
Hmm.
they were also creating and designing entire businesses around the podcast and around a community of people who had similar interests.
Yeah.
And a long time ago, actually, when I still had the yoga studio and I was trying to figure out what on earth to do to make it work, and I was like pushing and pushing that one specific business model, I had done a coaching with a woman named Kimberly Wilson. And Kimberly is somebody who, she is like my entrepreneurial crush. She is, has been a yoga teacher. She owned 2 yoga studio locations in Washington, D.C. for 18 years, which she just recently sold her yoga studio brand to another yoga studio, like national yoga studio
Wow.
chain. She is a writer. She's a fashion designer. She now is a psychotherapist. She runs a nonprofit rescue for pigs and pugs. It's called Pigs and Pugs Rescue. And she does these retreats. So she does like multiple retreats per year, yoga and writing, yoga and meditation, yoga and art in like Paris and Tuscany and Costa Rica. And she's incredible.
Yeah.
And Kimberly has had a podcast for more than 10 years, like before there were iPhones. And so I had done an online or a business coaching with her, like a phone coaching with her way back when I had the studio. And she had said to me at that time, you know, you should really consider starting a podcast. And her rationale for it was, you know, being in Chicago, like Chicago is a fairly big market, but it's still a box, right? A geographical location. And there's only so many people in that box. And even, you know, most people aren't going to travel from the north side of Chicago to downtown or vice versa to get to a yoga studio. They're just going to stay within their little spot. And so she had said that you're still fairly limited if you are bound by geographical location. But as soon as you have a podcast, you've now opened up your potential for who you can reach and who you can serve and who can be part of your community. And that most of the clients who were going on her retreats or buying her book or purchasing her clothing line, most of those clients were actually coming from her podcast as opposed to from her physical location yoga studio.
Yeah.
But that it took time. So it's like somebody would be listening to her podcast for 3 years before ever purchasing something from her or signing up to work with her, because it is this long process of developing an intimate relationship with someone.
Yeah.
And so that had stuck in my mind, but I didn't have the bandwidth to do it at the time that she said it. But then once the yoga studio had kind of cleared, I'd gone through this little bout of depression and identity, like, who am I? What do I do? How do I be an entrepreneur when I have no money and I have no business? And so I thought, you know, I could do that. I could create a podcast. I have this expertise. I have a background in performance. I know about yoga and meditation. And so it was just like those little seeds all kind of like coming together into this idea. And then from there, it just sort of started to grow.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that so much. And I remember in one of your podcasts listening to you kind of explain this process too, and you talking about like that, you know, that period of depression that you had and how you just like lay in bed and that these voices are so comforting to you to just like lay there and you're just so sad and you know, a little lost, but like these voices were like, I don't think you use the term friends, but you know, like you felt connected to them, you know?
Yeah. And it was like, I could envision, it's sort of like they were creating a world for me in a way that like if I was reading a fictional novel, it might be a lovely world, but it's fiction.
Yeah.
But in these podcasts, these worlds are real and these communities of listeners are real. And so I was like, oh, this is like my like, this is possible. This is like my beacon of hope.
Yes, I love that. I want to ask, kind of like reverse back. I know that we're like before we like delve into like your
Yeah.
podcasting stuff, I want to go back and ask you. So I heard the term spiritual entrepreneur the other day.
Yeah.
And I feel like yoga and meditation definitely falls into that bracket. And I've never heard that term before, but I think it's interesting, right? Like fear coaches which I met with one once, actually, Tori Washington. She was great. So she would like fall under that like spiritual entrepreneur. I have some thoughts to say about this, but I'd love to hear your perspective of like, as a spiritual entrepreneur, as someone who's like, you were probably saying those mantras and you probably had your affirmations going. You know what I mean? You probably had like, you were taught like, I can manifest a successful business, you know? I can manifest this money into my life or whatever. And then it didn't happen. Obviously, I have some things of,
Yeah.
not sounding so bleak, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that and how you were able to like grapple with how the new age world can like kind of be a downer sometimes.
So it's a good way to think about it. So there's a few things. One, I feel like things happen cosmically for a reason in the time that they're supposed to happen. And I honestly, on one hand, don't think that my dharma, so there's a spiritual entrepreneur word for you, but my path, I don't think that my path and my mission and my life's work was to be a yoga studio owner. And that's one reason it didn't work out. Also, at the same time, I think that I had to do that, and I had to have the failure in order to be able to progress on the path that I am progressing on. So it's kind of like it was meant to be, but it wasn't the right thing, but it had to happen to be on the right path kind of thing. And you can only see those things in retrospect. You cannot see them when you're in the moment at all. There's absolutely no way.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make them suck any less when they're happening.
Yeah.
The other part of it was that I think that as much as I believe in affirmations and mantras and essential oils and even like tarot or astrology or any of that, I also don't think that you can just like meditate and law of attraction yourself to success. I think that there's also like real hard business facts and skills that you need to know and that you need to have. And so it's a balance of the two.
Right.
And there was a lot that I just didn't know. And I had to learn the hard way, and that's fine. And then the third thing is that I was working so hard and so much and pushing so hard and trying to make things work and running myself ragged that I wasn't in practice. So when you are spending a lot of your time and energy and brain space in the business of yoga, most days I did not feel like actually doing yoga.
Right. I've heard that so many times.
It didn't feel relaxing for me. It did not relieve stress. It created more stress. Even my teachers who I had hired at the studio, I loved those teachers, obviously, because I hired them. And I would be like, oh, I'm going to take one of those classes because it's my studio. It's free. I love these teachers. I'm going to take their class. And I'd be so stressed out the whole time because I would notice like this corner of the yoga studio that it looked like it hadn't been swept in a month. Or I would notice that, there's like a student who came in late and it was disrupting all the other students. And now I like worrying about the student experience of whatever. Or I would be like, why did my teacher who I hired, who teaches in my studio, who I love, why is she playing this horrible playlist? Like all of these things just be distracting me.
Yeah.
And it was really hard to be consistent in my practice when I had a checklist of 5 million things. And even though you intellectually know that you should be meditating and you shouldn't skip your meditation practice just because you have to do payroll, it's kind of like one of those things that it's really hard to be consistent. And I was not taking proper care of myself physically, mentally, spiritually, none of that. It wasn't that I was not doing it at all. It just was that I wasn't in as consistent of a place as I am now. And it's still hard even now. It's like, I just had an intuitive reading with another fellow podcaster who we did this reading on her show for me, and she was like, oh, she's a clairvoyant, so she sees things. That's right?
Super vulnerable, by the way.
It was amazing.
Ooh.
And she's like, I see this clock with the clock hands going around and around and around. She's like, are you sleeping or are you just working all the time? And I was like, I'm working pretty hard right now. Like right now I'm working pretty hard. Wow. And she's like, are you taking time for self-care? And I'm like, oh, self-care.
Alone.
So it's definitely like, yes, manifesting is a thing. It's a word that at this point in time, I feel like it's a little played out and I'm kind of sick of hearing it. There's a few of those words that I'm kind of like, but I think that there's a balance between the spiritual type of work combined with the nuts and bolts and daily activities and productivity and being organized and knowing, what processes to put in place for your business. And then there's also the piece of like making sure that you're being consistent with what you are offering. So if my yoga studio, if I was my own brand, which I heard that a million times, you are your brand, you are your brand, you are your own brand. If I was trying to sell a healthier lifestyle, if I was trying to sell stress relief, if I was trying to sell these things and I had circles under my eyes and I was eating an albeit healthy lunch, but I was inhaling it in 3 minutes before I did the next thing, then I'm not living the lifestyle that I'm trying to sell. And I think when there's a disconnect between that ideal and then the reality, then it can be a little bit hard for people to swallow, pardon my extended pun.
Okay, love it. No, I think that's great. And I just, have you, maybe she's a cliche for you, but White Hot Truth, Danielle LaPorte's book?
Yes. So actually I love Danielle LaPorte. She's one of my, when you asked me to think of books, resources, podcasts that have inspired me, she's on my list. Not that book, a different one, but yeah, I love that one too.
Yeah, I feel like in the day and age of like all this spiritual, voices and new agey voices, like I feel like she just kind of cuts through it, and it just has some real talk. And I just appreciate you kind of talking about like, sure, yes, you can manifest all day long, but if you have no business know-how, like it's going to be a rough road for you. But at the same time, like what you were talking about, like that wasn't the right road for you to be on, and you learned so much. And I mean, I'd probably venture to say, and you can confirm, that you wouldn't go back and do it differently. Like you would, maybe you do some things differently. You open the practice, right? Like you would still pursue having a yoga studio.
Yeah, I think I would. And at the same time, knowing what I know now, I would go about it a different way. And maybe, who knows? I mean, if we could have a time machine, maybe the result would be different. And maybe I would stick with it. But I can definitely see if I was to go back in time and try it again, I would hope that the primary lesson I would have learned was not to try to do everything myself. Yeah. And I would have sooner tried to figure out how to bring in other people so that all of my time wasn't absorbed by it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Which is the Kimberly Wilson way of doing it.
I'll have to look her up. She sounds great. I remember you talking about how she like she sold her studio and it like shocked you.
It did. But I just interviewed her for my podcast and I haven't released it yet. And so we talked a little bit about that. And it's interesting because here's this person who, and I shouldn't be telling Kimberly's story, but here's this person who, like I said, she's my entrepreneurial crush. She had her studio for 18 years, 2 locations. And I'm like, if I could just be like Kimberly Wilson. But she ended up selling it for many of the same reasons that I ended up closing mine, just from like a different place. So we had a lot of the same experiences and challenges, even though our paths were sort of different of how we came to those conclusions.
And yours was a lot shorter.
Much shorter.
But I'm saying like in a good way, like you learned your lessons really quickly, you know? Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Well, I want to ask you about like your current day podcasting. Mm-hmm. I'd love to ask you specifically, like for creative entrepreneurs, when should they launch their own podcast, and when should they not even consider launching a podcast?
So like many things, if you had asked me who should launch a podcast in the beginning when I first started, like let's say in the first 6 to 8 months that I had a podcast, I would have said, everyone should have a podcast. Everyone should start one.
Yeah.
It's not that hard to launch. And I would have said the same thing in my first year of business. In my first year of owning a yoga studio, I'm like, who would ever keep a job? Everyone should be an entrepreneur. Everyone should start their own business. This is amazing.
Yeah.
I think that podcasting is an amazing platform for entrepreneurs specifically. If you have a compelling brand and mission that is something that can resonate on a very personal individual level with people, especially if, you know, like we say, if you are your brand, I think that podcasting is a great opportunity for connecting with people. It is not something to do if you are looking for a new way to immediately make more money in your business.
Not a moneymaker, folks.
It is definitely in the category of what they call long tail marketing strategies. So like when I spoke with Kimberly, she had said, yeah, I have people listening to my podcast who've been listening to it for 3 years, 5 years. And then they reach out and book a consultation with me.
Wow.
And then they buy a $3,000 retreat package from me. But it can take a long time.
Years. Wow.
But then those people who've been listening all that time, it took a while, but then once they're in, they're like dedicated, they're loyal, they feel like they know you. And so you've created that whole know, like, and trust over this long period of time, which is like, well, that's a long time, but it wasn't like 3 to 5 years of constant emails back and forth and phone calls and free consultations and stuff like that. It's just you creating this content and they're like developing this whole relationship with you completely on their own until the moment that they're ready to reach out and become a client or a customer. So I think that podcasting is something that you can add to your mix of what you're already doing. And it's something that can really build a long-term rapport. And I think that it's also something that you are going to have to be willing and able to invest either time or money or both. So like for me, from the time that I had the idea to start a podcast, I had no money. I had negative money. And so for me, I could not hire a consultant. I could not outsource anything. I had to figure out how to DIY everything. And it took me about a year from the time that I initially had the idea to the time I actually had episodes in iTunes. And that's because I had to do everything with free tutorials, sort through this, figure this out, cobble together my recording equipment. And yet you could launch within, like, you have an idea and you're launched within a month if you can do something like hire me to help you get started and do a lot of that work for you and tell you this is exactly what you need to order. This is exactly this, and this. But then you're going to invest more financially upfront in order to have that shorter amount of time. So you're going to have to figure out what it is that you have available to invest, and know that this is a very effective strategy for growing a very committed, loyal listenership and following, but that it's going to take some time. And so then it's part of your mix.
So tell me how long you've done your podcast. I think that I had only listened to like 2 of your episodes before I hired you, but I did listen to, so first things first, I highly recommend anyone and everyone to hire Andrea if you're considering a podcast. Like what you're saying, it just like streamlines the process, and you get so much out of it that you would as, like what you're saying. Of course you can on your own do all the research and have experience, but it just takes so much more time. So I'd love to hear, in your experience, how long you've had your podcast for. I know you have a ton of episodes, and how you've seen, I know that Kimberly said, in some cases 5 years.
In some cases.
What benefits you've seen reap from it. One of them is being on the podcast, being a speaker at the podcast movement, which is amazing.
Yeah.
What are some other things that you've seen, like benefits of doing it that you've seen personally?
Yeah. So I have had my show, I've had my show for about 2.5 years. The Creative Imposter, that's the first show that I started. And so we're at like episode 65, I think, right now. And I just recently this year launched a new podcast, which is Podcast Envy, which is all about the craft of podcasting. And so that is, I think this week today we'll be posting episode number 7. So that's a little baby podcast. And in that period of time, so when I started the Creative Imposter, I had that sort of vague idea that I could create a podcast and that somehow from there a business and a community could follow, but I didn't actually 100% know how. Mm-hmm. I was still also DIY researching that and saying, well, how have other people done it? What can that be? And I still didn't fully know, do I still want to be a yoga and meditation teacher? Do I want to be a consultant? Still didn't know exactly what I was selling. So one thing that the podcast has helped me to do is to figure out what exactly I'm selling based on who started listening and what they need and feedback that I've gotten from them. And so this business of helping other people launch their podcasts, that was not my original intention at all.
Yeah.
That was a pure thing of people saying, wow, I love your podcast. I want to have a podcast. How do I do that?
Yeah.
And so then I would say, well, you do this, 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 and this. And then I'm like, oh, wait, why am I giving away all the information that took me a year to accumulate
Cool.
for free? And so it helped me figure out what I actually wanted to do. And it helped me sort of cultivate what my business offerings were. And the yoga and meditation thing didn't go away. That's sort of still also a flavor that gets interwoven into the work that I do. And then when you look at my clients, it's like, oh, one of my clients is a holistic health and wellness expert. Yeah. Another client is an herbalist and registered dietitian. Another client is an artist and creative entrepreneur. Like it all sort of fits within my brand, just the clients that I naturally attract. Figuring out my new business model and figuring out who my community is has been one thing. Another thing that's been super useful is actually, because I am doing interviews, are the connections that I've been making. So for example, here, talking with you, we may or may not have ever met or had this connection if not for the podcast.
Yeah.
And so then here's an opportunity for me to work with you and connect with people in your network and vice versa. So really meeting more people, expanding my professional network, having more resources, more opportunities to speak and get in front of new audiences has been a really huge benefit. And now also a lot of my business income actually comes from teaching podcasting in a high school setting. So I have this whole program that I've developed where I'm teaching podcasting in a Chicago public high school for students with diverse learning challenges. Again, none of that was anything I would have ever imagined when I had the yoga studio.
Yeah.
That was not at all on my radar,
Yeah.
but it's sort of like by having the show, somebody hears the show and they say, oh, you're doing this thing. I know somebody who needs someone to do this thing, which is kind of like that. Would you be interested? And it just sort of creates this breadcrumb trail of new opportunities that end up becoming like something that when you're on the right track, it's like, yeah, this is actually in flow, and this is actually in alignment, and this actually is work that's really important and meaningful to me that I would have never sought out on my own had I not started this one particular thing. So it's just kind of opened everything up.
Yeah. Oh, Andrea, I love it so much. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left here.
Sure.
So if you could, sorry to rush you, but if you could tell me in like a sentence, I asked you what top feminist topic matters the most to you right now. I'd love to hear that. And then after that, I'd love to hear like your top like 2 or 3 books that you really love.
Yeah. So I don't know, one sentence. I don't really know how to describe this feminist topic because I don't necessarily always think in terms of feminist versus not. I just think of issues. And I think that the way I would say this is it's an issue of representation and voice, especially because I'm working with students from underrepresented populations and students who are in the disabled community, students who are in the neuroatypical community, students who are primarily Black and Hispanic, and then also, tying this into feminism and working with women, I feel and notice a lot more how underrepresented voices in general get squashed down, and how even in the podcasting space, it's a largely white male dominated space even now. And so in Facebook groups, let's say podcasting Facebook groups, somebody posts something, I or another woman posts a comment to be helpful and give an insight. And then all of a sudden, all these other people are like, well, that's a dumb idea. Well, that's not the best way to do it. Well, you don't know what you're talking about because this is the real way to do it. And that's a silly example, but it's still this frustrating thing of how women are constantly not being trusted or not being given the same amount of authority or platform or opportunity. And in general, I think this is something that's very hot in the world right now, is like paying attention to these voices that have been sort of squashed down and not been well represented.
Totally. No, I think it's not a silly example at all because it just shows you like this isn't just happening in like huge politics. This is happening in Facebook groups,
about podcasting. Like it's not life or death.
Right. Yeah, on like the smallest granular level. It just is throughout our entire like system. Okay, cool. All right. So give me your recommendations, book recommendations, articles, whatever.
Okay. So 3, I mentioned Kimberly Wilson. Obviously, she has a podcast, Tranquility du Jour, but everything Kimberly Wilson inspires me. Seth Godin, again, anything Seth Godin totally inspires me. The book that changed my perception of entrepreneurship is The Icarus Deception.
And I haven't read that. I love Seth Godin too. I'll have to look it up.
It's so good. It's an oldie but goodie. And he has a brand new podcast. I don't know if you know this. He has a brand new podcast called Akimbo.
I haven't listened to it, but I feel like I heard about it. But again, I'll have to look it up because I love him.
I want a new episode every morning. I want to wake up every morning and have a new episode from Seth. I feel like everything in my life would be better if I could have that, but I will settle for what he has time to produce. And then my third one is Danielle Laporte, actually. The book that really inspired me, I found it at the end as the yoga studio was kind of coming to an end, and I was coming to terms with that and making peace with that. The fire starter sessions is like hugely, hugely, hugely important in my evolution as an entrepreneur.
Oh, I love that. Such great recommendations. I'm excited to look into all of them because I haven't delved into any of them, and I'm such a recommendation geek. So that's why I always make sure to have that in these.
I know.
You're my third call, by the way. You're my third video.
Woo, yay. This is so exciting.
Andrea, I really appreciate you and just everything that you shared and opening up. And yeah, I'm just such a fan of yours. And so thank you so much for sharing everything and taking your time today.
You are very welcome. Thank you for tuning in all the way from halfway around the world.
I know, crazy, right? All right, well, have a good day, and we will talk later. I'll email you about the retreat stuff.
Perfect. Yay.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.